In today's video, we're going to quickly walk you through how we turned a piece of raw land into a thriving garden in just a few months.
Then we're going to do a full tour of the garden right now, as well as answer some gardening questions from our community on Patreon.
Since our starting point for this garden was an overgrown pasture, the first step was knocking down the grass and weeds, which were about shoulder high. We left all the ground up plants in place, which helped us inject some good organic matter and nutrients into the soil as it broke down. It also mulched the seed bank to help prevent new weeds and grasses from sprouting.
If we had just left it at that and then put down some compost to make our beds and plant into them, all of those weeds and grasses would eventually have made their way back up through the soil and taken over and just smothered everything else. So we needed to kill them first. For our veggie gardens, we like to use a no-till method that involves smothering weeds and grasses with a large silage tarp.
We like to use the silage tarp instead of tilling because tilling can destroy the soil structure, and that harms the biology of the soil and the networks of fungi and beneficial bacteria that live there and help the plants thrive.
And it can also lead to more compaction over time as you till over and over again.
There are a lot of applications where tilling is kind of necessary and probably the best way to go if done carefully. We actually tilled a larger plot up the hill, which was kind of too big to do the silage tarp method. And now that we've tilled it and killed the turf and planted our crop in there, we'll probably start to manage it as a no-till garden in the coming years.
So in our garden, we put the silage tarp down in late winter, and it took about a month and a half to fully kill the weeds and grass underneath. If you're doing it in a warmer season, it can take as little as 2 weeks when you have all that hot sun baking everything underneath.
Once the grass was good and dead, we laid down contractor paper, which will keep the seed bank from sprouting because the sunlight can't reach it. And then we covered the contractor paper in compost for the beds and wood chips for the rows. After a few good rains, that contractor paper will break down and then the roots will be able to go right through it.
The second half of the garden is slightly downhill, and so it remained much wetter, especially after a rain, because parts of the pasture drained into it. So to remedy the overly wet, soggy soil, we ended up digging 2 irrigation ponds and then using the topsoil to build up mounds.
And these mounds are where we planted our Three Sisters garden and our melon and squash patch, which we'll show you later in the garden tour.
And they've been working really well. We've had a very wet spring, and so we've still had a lot of water moving into the garden, and they have remained, above the water and thriving.
Yeah, there were a couple times where the water came up to the top of the mounds, and if that was just flat soil, it would have drowned all the plants that were in there, but they're doing really well.
Mounds were the way to go.
Yeah.
Our soil is naturally a little more acidic than is ideal for a lot of annual vegetable crops, so we ended up sweetening it or making it more alkaline by adding some lime as well as a bunch of ashes from our wood stove, which are naturally alkaline.
The compost that we built the beds with will add some good organic matter and nutrients as well as what's already in the native soil, but we also added a sprinkling of blood meal and bone meal for some added nitrogen and phosphorus, which will help the plants grow strong.
We have a very large and healthy deer population here in western Pennsylvania, so if we just built up the garden, planted it, and left it at that, we would have just made the world's most finely maintained and labor-intensive deer salad bar. So to really have a successful garden, we had to build a deer fence.
Other than a few rolls of contractor paper, the fence was really the only thing we had to buy to build this garden, and it was about $1,200, but with food prices today and they're continuing to rise, we'll probably make up for that in, a couple of months this summer?
Yeah, and the fence should last us years and years, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
So a worthwhile investment.
Yeah.
Thin them out if too many of them come up.
Once we had the beds built, the fence up, and the weather got warm enough, it was time to start planting.
We started most of our seedlings in small trays from seeds that we saved from last year and some from heirloom seed companies. And as of a few weeks ago, the garden is fully planted and thriving.
Woo! So now that it is all planted out and growing, we're going to take you on a tour, show you where everything is planted and how it's doing.
But first, a quick message from today's sponsor, which as usual is us. If you enjoy today's garden tour, but you want more in-depth information on how we prepare beds, specific growing guides for our favorite crops, and cooking tutorials, we recommend checking out our online gardening video course.
And we also have a book that just came out 2 months ago, and you can order it from any major bookseller.
Or if you want to support an independent bookstore, you can order it from the bookstore where Sylvan's mom works, which we have linked below, and those are all signed copies.
So, oh, I'm sorry. I just dripped hot coffee on her shoulder.
It's fine, it just surprised me.
All right, take two. So we like to come out in the garden in the morning and just kind of walk through and see how things are doing and what we might want to work on that day. So we're gonna take you around for our little walk through today.
Let's go. So I want to show you all the plants, but first I realized we forgot a very important thing, which is to let the ducks out to run around in the garden with us. We do have to be a little vigilant because if we take our eyes off of them for too long, they'll start nibbling on the plants. But mostly they eat the clover and the bugs, which is great. All right, duckies. All right, you gotta get down so you can get out. Ready? Woohoo! Everybody out! Everybody out! Come on. No eating the sunflowers. Hey. They mostly just sample. But we have this nice area of long grass that gets pretty mucky, so it's perfect for them because they can, you know, dabble their little bills in and find bugs. And there's also lots of grass for them to eat. And they know that the best place to find slugs is in the Ruth Stout potato beds with all that old hay.
This is what we call slug patrol.
Slug patrol!
We really don't have any slug damage on our plants, which, you know, since we're right next to a really wet area, you would expect that, but slug patrol takes care of it. Not distracted. Let's talk about the garden.
Yeah. We can start back here though.
All right.
So, this is our trellis O beans. Those are scarlet runner beans just starting to take off, and then we have a bunch of Cherokee black beans. So we figured might as well take advantage of having the fence area to still grow some stuff. These grow really tall. Big fan of pole beans for that reason, because they take up such a small amount of space, you know, horizontally, as long as you give them room to grow vertically. And the flowers of these runner beans are beautiful. They're just starting to open. Hummingbirds love them, which is cool. And they make delicious beans. These were some of the first beds we made with the first soil we were digging out of the lake. We just piled it up and then we...
The lake?
I guess I'm being a little...
Hey everybody, you want to see our lake?
Our pond! Out of our pond. Not to be too self-aggrandizing of the hole we dug. Anyway, out of our pond. And we kind of did it gradually. So we started by planting all these onions and potatoes and strawberries, and then we added some more. And we didn't have anything in particular that we were planning on planting here. So in classic Geordie hodgepodge style, he just stuck some corn, beans, and chickpeas in. But you know, the chickpeas are looking great and the corn is growing strong. So actually look, these chickpeas have have pods forming already, which is exciting.
These are the Kabuli chickpeas.
Yeah. And if you saw in one of our previous videos about building these beds, you know that this is our Ruth Stout potato bed with very old hay from the old barn that we took down to build our house. And then over here, we have potatoes that we did in a different style where we just added a bunch of compost to the bed. And you can see a pretty clear difference, I would say, in terms of growth, well, even just success at coming up, and then also in growth. But I'm not going to count out the Ruth Stout until we have a chance to actually get our harvest and weigh it. And then we have a couple of strawberry beds here. Some of those strawberries got frosted in a late frost that we had this spring, but they're already putting out runners. You can see here all these runners, and so we're just going to let them continue to put out runners and fill in the bed for free. So no need to buy more strawberry plants. And then back there we have fava beans that are just starting to set pods. They're looking a little funky, but you know.
Fava beans like it when it's a little cooler and it's been like
98 degrees. Yeah.
So they're struggling a little
They're
bit.
struggling, but we'll see. I think there's some starting to form. Yeah, there's some little guys
Yeah, they
starting to
look
form.
terrible when the flowers start to make pods. They look like they're rotting, but
Yeah.
there's seed pods
It's
under
just
there.
how they do.
Yeah.
And past our other potatoes, we have our experimental bed. So this was exciting. We were like, all right, we finally have more space for our garden. We're gonna try growing some plants that we normally wouldn't, feel like it was worth it to dedicate valuable growing space to, and just see how they do. So we have Bo, which is a black-eyed pea that's grown in Africa, I think specifically like Eastern Africa, Kenya and areas, and it's actually grown for the greens. And when we were in Kenya,
Kumawiki.
yeah, when we were in Kenya, we had some of these and they were delicious. So I'm really excited to try making it myself. And then this is evolutionary wheat. So it's like a, very ancestral wheat. I think people have been trying to grow like perennial wheat from it, trying to like experiment with that, but we're just kind of growing it to see what it does. We have foxtail millet. This is another grain, which again, we're not gonna get a lot of grain from this size space, but it's a great trial. So if it does well in this amount of space, we'll maybe plant a big section of it in the upper field. And then down here, we have an exciting plant. If anybody recognizes it, these are peanuts, which we used to grow in North Carolina. We have not grown them yet up here in Pennsylvania. So we're excited to see if they work out. Obviously, it's a bit cooler and shorter of a season. But they have flowers. Their flowers are absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and something that I think is really interesting about the way that peanuts flower or make their fruit is that, they grow underground and people think of them as like a root crop. But they're actually, they make the flowers, and then once the flowers pollinated, they fall down to the ground and they bury themselves. You can kind of see some of them starting to do that.
Yeah. And this is some rice. So this is an upland rice. We do get a lot of water, as you can probably tell from the mucky areas around the edges of the garden. So we figured, why not try some rice and see how it does. Here's the cucurbit zone, a cucurbit zone. So we have some squash and some cucumbers. These are pickling cucumbers because I love some pickles. Just starting to go up our trellis, just a really simple trellis with this Hortonova. It's very strong and it's reusable, so it doesn't look the best, but it's good. It gets the job done. And then these are a summer squash called Kusa squash. This is a Middle Eastern variety of squash. And Jordan, do you want to say how you grew up eating this?
Yeah, so you core out the middle, you take the middle out, and then you stuff it with meat and rice. It's called kusa mashi. And then you stew it in tomatoes, and it's delicious.
It is really delicious. And Jordan's dad is a fiend for these. So we grew some for us, and then enough that we could definitely share some with him. And then we grow lots of beans in our garden. Hopefully in future years, we'll grow more of those in the staple crop field. But for now, they're in the garden because we eat a lot of beans.
Well, we're also growing them in the staple crop
yes,
field.
true. We always run out of beans first in the winter. So
yeah.
Grow more beans is always the answer. So this is, I don't even remember, what variety is this? Gaucho or something?
Well, we did label it.
Yeah. Believe it or not.
All right, so these first ones are cannellini, and then there's a little patch of green beans, and the ones you're looking at, Sylvan, are pinto beans.
Oh, pinto. Awesome. Cool. Oh, and then these are lima, which I'm really excited for butter beans. Southern folks know butter beans are where it's at. They're like baby limas. So hopefully these do well. They're a bush variety of lima, which is not that common. Usually you have really tall pole bean limas, so I want to see how they do.
And something that we did on the end of each row is we just planted cantaloupe on the ends so that those can grow out into the melon patch here, and we don't, waste that space.
Let's talk about the melon patch.
All right.
While we're here, so you might think, wow, this is really far spaced apart. Why would they do that? And one was because we only had so much topsoil from the lake, aka pond, and we were tired, but also we knew that we wanted to have these mounds with vining plants like cantaloupe and watermelon and give them lots of space to sprawl. So that's what we have going on here. So these are gonna take up lots of this area. The watermelon, which you see here with its nice lacy leaves. We have a few different varieties that we're trying. Alibaba.
I think this one's starting to make a melon.
Ooh.
Where are they?
That's male, male. I saw one.
Oh, there you go.
Oh yeah.
So there's the female flower, because it has that little, basically baby melon on it. It's ovum.
Let's not get too technical.
And then we also have cantaloupe, and we're just gonna try a bunch of varieties and see how they do. And also they'll probably end up cross-pollinating and we'll get a little land race going, which we've been talking about, being excited to try doing land races of a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, and we also have, just because the mound is here and the watermelons, they're gonna use the space on the ground. So we planted sunflowers. And some climbing beans to use the vertical space, similar to what we'll talk about over there, which is the traditional Three Sisters garden.
Well, now that you mentioned that, Jordan, let's go check it out.
Okay. So this section of the garden is my pride and joy, the Three Sisters patch, which is a traditional way of growing these three crops together all over Mesoamerica. This is how it's been done for like 10,000 years. And we really think it's cool to continue that tradition. This is a Hopi blue corn that we're growing in here. And then that's the heirloom pumpkin or winter squash from Sylvan's mom's garden. We've been saving seeds from that for, I don't know, 8 years at this point?
Yeah, wow.
And it's basically just a land race that has a bunch of genetic variation, but it always does really well for us here. And then we did a variety of climbing beans all around here. And something that we like to remind people when it comes to a Three Sisters patch is that the corn is the oldest sister, the beans are the middle child, and the squash or pumpkins are the babies. And that's an important part of the traditional story, because if you plant the squash too early, it takes over the whole patch and shades everything out and nothing else can grow. If you plant the beans too early, they can't climb the corn, so they just kind of topple over and go on the ground. So the corn needs to be planted first, and then once that sister is about 1 foot tall, you can plant the beans, and then that'll give them a head start so they can have something to actually climb up. And then finally you plant the squash, and then that sister sprawls all around and keeps the ground shaded out so that the moisture doesn't evaporate as much. And altogether, they just work great together. Sometimes people think if the beans are climbing up the corn, they're gonna pull them down. But when you plant them in these mounds, the beans actually tie the corn together and form like a triangle or a pyramid if there's more than two. And that's actually a much stronger structure than just a corn stalk standing up. So often when corn gets blown over or lodged in a big field, the Three Sisters patches will still be standing because they're just,
stronger together.
They're stronger together, yeah. They're a big network basically once they all get up to a mature height.
This is our greens bed. It's funny, we don't grow, I feel like, as many greens as maybe some people do in their garden because we end up foraging a lot of salad greens. And actually down at the end here, we have a wild plant that's often called a weed that we pulled out of another spot and intentionally planted here. So this is lamb's quarters, and it's related to spinach. And it's delicious and nutritious, and I think even better than spinach, and it grows amazingly, as you can see. So spinach right now would probably be bolting like crazy and really sad in this heat, but lamb's quarters is doing just fine. And as you can see, our arugula is bolting, so we'll take this out pretty soon, probably feed the scraps to the ducks, because they love greens, and then replant this with some other kind of green, maybe some more kale or collards. And this might be one of my favorite garden plants that we've just started growing in the past few years. These are the Desi chickpeas. This is a variety called Miles. And they're very compact. The flowers, they're done flowering actually. They're already making lots of pods, but they are beautiful. I just love these like lacy leaves that they have. And you can see they look quite a bit different from the Kabuli chickpeas, which we have down in the rest of the bed and in another bed over there. And while the plants are smaller, the pods themselves and the chickpeas are also smaller. So they're not as good for things like hummus. And we have to have lots of hummus in our household. So that's why we're growing lots of Kabuli chickpeas, and hopefully they do really well too.
Yeah.
And then next to our chickpeas, we have beets and carrots. Whoa, I almost fell over. So these beets
are about ready to harvest.
Yeah, they are ready to harvest. These are Touchstone Gold, so they're a golden beet. Yeah, looking good. And And this is great that they are about ready to harvest because we have a plan to plant some more sweet corn in this bed once these are ready. So it's always good to keep in mind your succession and what you can plant after a crop. So we know that these short spring crops can come out and we'll still have time to do a longer season summer crop.
FYI, these leaves might look familiar if you like to eat Swiss chard, because beets and Swiss chard are actually the exact same plant. Beets are just bred to have a big bulbous
Big
root.
butt.
And yeah, and Swiss chard is bred to have big colorful leaves.
Yeah, so definitely eat your beet greens.
Yeah.
One thing I want to point out in our carrot bed is we have this, this weed growing here called purslane. If you have never eaten this, it is so good and good for you. It's a succulent, so it does really well even in dry conditions. And I have found that it really doesn't negatively impact the plants that it grows alongside because it is a succulent and it really stays on the surface. So I just let it grow. We just let it grow so that we can harvest it as a bonus crop. And
yeah, we don't
it's
call
great.
it a weed, it's a bonus crop.
It is, yeah. Next is our herb bed. We're excited to be able to have a bunch of perennial herbs as well as annual herbs, lots of parsley for making tabbouleh and different salads and things, oregano, lavender, thyme, and then lots of basil so we can make lots of pesto to freeze because that's a really great thing to have on hand. And then down here we have some more, I don't know, experimental herbs. Not this, that's cilantro. We grow that every year. But this is za'atar. It's basically like a kind of thyme, but it's an important seasoning in a lot of Middle Eastern food. So we're excited to grow that this year. And then these are sesame plants, which are also, they're great in so many things. But if we were ever to try and make our own tahini, we would need to grow lots of sesame. Yeah. So we're trying it out this year.
And this is another thing. Obviously, this is just a little experiment. 4 plants aren't going to give us any significant amount of sesame seeds, but if they do well, next year we can plant a whole bunch of them up in the staple crop field. And then yeah, homegrown tahini.
That would be something cool. These are more chickpeas, the Kabuli variety, so we showed you those. They're doing well though. We'll hopefully get lots of them. And then these are the superstar beans of the season so far. These are Tiger's Eye, and you can see just how tall and vigorous, and they're already covered in pods and flowers. We grew, I think, 1 or 2 plants of these last year as an experiment.
One plant in a pot.
One plant in a pot, and it made enough beans that we were like, all right, we gotta continue to grow this. So yeah, so far we're very happy.
Beautiful too. They have these like brown and black swirls on them.
Yeah. And then the rest of the bed is black turtle beans. So those are a black bush bean. And I love the black beans because they have these lovely purple flowers, which I think are so charming. Over here we have another, hodgepodge bed. So these are soybeans. We'll probably harvest them mainly for edamame, but we may let some of them go to maturity as well, just to save seed from. And
we can also make tamari.
Yeah, we might make like miso and soy sauce, which would be cool. And then this is sweet corn, right? That Jordan just planted. Yeah, so we're gonna have some sweet corn. And the nice thing is, you may be wondering, but Sylvan and Jordan, aren't you worried about cross-pollination between your corns? And you should, that is something to keep in mind, but by doing them at such different times, they're not gonna be flowering at the same time or releasing pollen at the same time, so we won't have to worry about that. All right, here's, just to show, we're not just showing the hits. These sad babies are eggplant. If you've ever grown eggplant and you have flea beetles in your garden, you know that something about eggplant, they just love. Like, it is the first thing that they go after. And the thing is, if they can grow past it, once the leaves are more mature, they're not as palatable to the flea beetles, so they can still survive. They just look really sad right now. So hopefully they can make it through this stage and we'll still get eggplant. More Kabuli chickpeas, because basically everywhere we were like, oh, we don't have anything written down in the garden plan. Jordan just went and sowed chickpeas before we could come up with any other ideas.
To be fair, it was me and Dre that did
Yes. And then we have
all the blame.
And then we have
all the credit.
Yes, okay. Non-chickpeas, shelling peas. So we have a couple varieties. One is like an English variety and one is a Syrian variety, which we haven't tried before. So we're excited to try that. But they're looking great.
The Syrian variety is making a ton though.
Yeah.
Look at all these pods that are set.
Yeah, I planted them very densely, and I did a very simple trellis, just sort of like a fishing net weave with some twine, and it actually worked really well. I was worried it might not be strong enough.
chickpeas planted all down the side here.
Who did that, I wonder?
I don't know. It could have been anybody.
All right, getting into the last few beds, which are essentials, peppers and tomatoes. So we grow a lot of hot peppers. I like it hot. Jordan has learned to like it hot.
I've always liked it hot, just not to the same level as you.
Yeah,
Even
hotter.
It's like scorpion peppers. And I think they're spicy.
So we grow a lot of hot peppers. You can also get so much bang for your buck, I feel like, with hot peppers, which is nice.
Oh, here's a jalapeno for me.
Nice. Aw, it's so cute. And as you can see, we have these Mondo radishes. So this was a companion planting. We'll talk more about that later. But they're just down the center, and we've mostly harvested all of them, but they came out before the peppers, you know,
Moo
needed the
also
space.
harvested a lot of them.
Yes, roll that clip because
Yeah.
it's amazing. So dexterous.
Is that a tasty radish?
Deftly done. You're gonna clean us out of radishes.
Stop eating all the radishes. You already had a bunch of deer meat and dog food for breakfast.
And then finally we have 2 tomato beds. So this one is mainly heirloom slicers and cherries. You know, we have the classic Cherokee Purple, Sun Gold. What else do we have in here? Some Brandywine, pork chop, which is a really fun yellow tomato that I love. And then our final row is our paste tomatoes. And we always want to dedicate a lot of space to paste tomatoes because we can so many tomatoes to have for the winter. So we have a few different kinds, some like Amish paste, Italian paste, one that we saved seeds from last year called Plum Dumpling. That's our own name, which I'm very excited about. And then this is interplanted on the shoulders with cilantro and dill, which are both going to seed now, but that's great because then we'll get coriander and dill seed as well. And so that's it for the veggie garden. We do have our whole staple crop field up that away, but that is still in its infancy. We also had to replant all of it this week because it rained so much the past couple of weeks that all of the seeds just basically disintegrated in the rain. And now we're gonna answer some questions from our friends on Patreon about gardening, how we do it, and general garden questions. Okay, you wanna read the first question?
So we asked our friends on Patreon to submit gardening questions, just kind of like general gardening questions that they had, and we got some awesome questions, so we're going to read through those and answer them. All right. So the first one is from Heather. Do you add fertilizer besides compost and mulch, and if so, what do you use? Some people swear by fish emulsion, but what would that do to the ponds?
That is a good question.
Yeah.
So we do add fertilizer, not a lot, but as we mentioned earlier, we put down some blood meal and some bone meal this year, and we do often water in our seedlings with some fish emulsion as well as some seaweed powder, just to give them some really available nutrients when they're getting started. And as you can watch in one of our previous videos, we actually made our own bone meal from deer bones last year, so we've used that as well. But to answer your question about the pond, I wouldn't worry about it too much because the amount that we're doing to water in those seedlings is staying pretty local. I don't think unless we had some huge rain event right afterwards, it would have really any impact on the ponds. But in general, you know, with the things like compost, etc., we're trying to manage the nutrient runoff. The ponds are kind of a big part of that.
Right.
So we have this long grass that we planted or we didn't plant it, it was there, but we kept it. That's between the garden and the ponds that will kind of soak up a lot of those nutrients. And then we can cut the grass regularly and put it on our compost pile. And then the ponds themselves, the ducks are in there eating stuff. I mean, they're pooping as well. So the ponds are definitely nutrient rich. But so far we haven't had any like algae issues. But if we did, we would just skim that off and throw it back on the garden, I think.
Yeah, but we also irrigate the garden with the ponds.
Right.
So that is basically like a fertilizer in itself, and then it keeps everything in a loop because there is always going to be nutrient runoff from any kind of gardening because you have a lot of tilthy soil and you're obviously putting a lot of nutrients on it. Some amount of that is going to get washed away. So this is kind of, the ponds are the solution to that in our opinion.
Yeah, great question.
All right, let's see. Then Sarah G, that's a familiar name. At what
That's my
stage? Yeah, that's my mother-in-law, Sylvan's mom. At what stage do you fertilize each crop, and how much feather meal or other fertilizer do you use? So yeah, that's a good question.
follow-up, yeah.
Building off of that other one. So we usually will lay down our fertilizer at the beginning of the season before we even plant anything, because organic fertilizers, unlike Miracle Grow or other synthetic fertilizers, organic fertilizers break down slowly. They're kind of like a slow release fertilizer, especially if you get a pelletized version, and then they'll just feed the plants over the whole season.
Yeah, so we just add a bit at planting. We will occasionally side dress crops that we know really like a lot of nitrogen. So corn, for example, is a pretty heavy feeder. So when it gets, what would you say? When do we usually?
Probably like after it makes a tassel. Usually you don't want to give plants a bunch of nitrogen before they start fruiting, because if they have nitrogen, helps promote leafy growth. So if they have a ton of nitrogen, they're like, oh, I'm living it up here. I don't need to make seeds. Like, I'll live here forever.
Yeah.
But if you give them nitrogen after they start transitioning into reproductive mode and they have flowers and fruit, that just goes towards helping keep all of that really healthy. But for things like greens and onions, you're only going for the leafy growth there, so a lot of nitrogen
believe it
is
or
good.
not, like onions, when you think about what the bulb of an onion is, it's essentially like the modified base of the leaves. So a lot of nitrogen for them is a good thing.
Right.
So I definitely will come through and, nothing crazy, but like give them some fish emulsion throughout the season, or if we had feather meal or something, just sprinkle a little of that throughout the season.
Yeah, I did learn when I was doing my apprenticeship how to calculate exactly how much feather meal you want to put down, like per acre, and then you divide it by how big the beds are. But we don't really do that anymore.
Once you do it a few times, you kind of just like, oh, okay, a little sprinkle here, a little sprinkle there.
It doesn't have to be a fine science. It can be if you wanted to, but with organic amendments, there's a lot more of a buffer to put a little bit too much or a little bit not enough, and they'll still do well.
Yeah.
Let's see. Brianna asked, what general area or growing zone are you guys in, and how many of each plant are you typically going for, like your beans, squash, gourds, and corn? Let's see. Well, our growing zone is 6A, which is, a mountainous, an eastern mountainous zone. So we're down in a valley where cool air tends to settle here. We're in a hollow in the valley. So it's probably even cooler than
Well, I think the
growing
general
zone.
area actually moved recently to 6B, but I bet we're still in 6A.
Right, because our microclimate is a little bit cooler.
Yeah,
but
we got some pretty late frosts this spring that it seemed like other areas didn't get.
RIP strawberry bed.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's filling back out now.
Yeah.
And then how many of each plant are you typically going for? I don't really keep track of stuff like that. I definitely don't have a detailed spreadsheet where I know exactly how many plants and how many calories they'll produce. Mm-hmm. We kind of maximize what we can grow in each plot. So actually, I know exactly how many corn plants are coming up in the Three Sisters patch, because there's 70 mounds and I planted 3 seeds in each. So there's 210 plants in there.
But how did we come to that? How do we decide to plant that many?
That's how much space we have.
Yeah, I think the answer to most of that for us anyway, because we have always had fairly limited space, is always like as much as we can.
Right.
But I guess there is a bit of a ratio in terms of like a lot of corn, because corn is a staple, right? It's like the backbone, the foundation of a lot of the meals. And then also a lot of beans, because beans go really well with the corn, and it's both a starch and a protein, and is really filling.
And obviously you can grow them right in the same plot like we did in the Three Sisters.
And then less so of some of, we still like to have lots of pumpkins because they're good storage things, but less so of things like, I don't know, cabbages or kale or whatever, because that's more of kind of an accessory to the meal.
Or like summer squash. A couple plants will give you more than enough.
More than
if you plant 3 plants, you're going to be just bringing like grocery bags full of them to all your friends and family, which is great. But, we planted 6 or 7 winter squash with the intention of giving a lot away, and we're probably still going to be drowning in them.
Yeah. I think the overall conclusion is, at this point, we're still in the stage of just like growing as much as we can of everything while fitting it all in. Now that we do
Yeah.
have more space, we'll see if we come to that point where we're like, we grew too much of this, but
Right.
it hasn't
We've
happened
got
yet.
a lot of friends and family
Yeah.
that will take all of this stuff. So anything that we feel like we grew too much of, or obviously, you know, there's just a certain amount that we want to share.
Yeah.
There will be mouths to eat it. Addie, I hope I'm saying people's names right. I like interact with you all on Patreon, and I'm always typing your names. I'm never actually saying them out loud. So hopefully I'm pronouncing them correctly. Addie asks, I would love to know what Chip Bro has to say about the wood chip buckets, or the chip buckets. I've also got a bit of chip to move. Nice.
Nice.
And I think that could be a great option.
If you're not moving chip, you could be missing out on 7 figures a day.
What?
I'm making 7 figures every day
Okay.
from wood chip.
So what are those called? Tub trugs? or
Yeah,
something?
like gorilla tubs
gorilla
or tub
tubs.
trugs.
Yeah.
They are really handy in the garden in general.
Yeah, and they're like a flexible plastic or rubber, which means they're much less likely to crack apart like a 5-gallon bucket or something, and you can flex them. So if you want to pour stuff in a
That's
kind
where
of a
it
straight
comes
line,
in handy for the wood chips. is
Yeah,
you get
exactly.
The precision pour.
right? So I definitely recommend those. And yeah, what would you look up? Gorilla cart?
If you look up tub trug or
Tub
gorilla
trug.
tub, not gorilla
Yeah.
cart. That's a totally
Oh,
different
that's a
thing.
different thing. Yeah, that's right. Those are also
you'll find
great.
them. Yeah.
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 All right, cool. Let's see. Heather asks, do we companion plant? Yes, for sure.
Do
I
we
think
ever?
it's a great way to maximize space. Like we were saying, you know, we've for so long gardened in small community gardens that we're just like squeezing things in wherever we can. But there's no reason not to do that when you have more space, because then you just maximize
Yeah.
what you're producing there.
And some of those added benefits. You know, I think sometimes the companion planting benefits can get a little overstated in terms of like,
Yeah.
if you plant marigolds next to your tomatoes, no bugs will ever find them or
Right.
something. You know, like it doesn't really work that way.
It might
But-
like marginally
Yeah.
help, but it's
there
not
are
It's not a
benefits.
shield.
Yeah, there are benefits. It can help with pest pressure. It can also help with, we always put like flowers at the end of the bed that are good for like parasitic wasps, you know, because we want to encourage them to proliferate in the garden. But mostly for us, it ends up being a bit of a space thing where it's like, oh, okay, we know we can grow herbs or scallions down
Right.
or beets down the edges of our tomato rows, because while the tomatoes are still getting established, there's plenty of room there, and those will be coming out sooner. Or growing the radishes down the center of a double row bed of peppers, because the radishes are going to be gone in 30 days and the peppers will still not be big enough to shade them out at that point.
Right.
So,
Yeah, if you like radishes, I mean, you can kind of do that
Put
with
them
anything.
anywhere. Yeah.
Anything, because radishes grow so fast. Anything that you're planting is going to be like barely established before you're pulling the radishes out, and
Right.
then it actually does help a little bit, because while the radishes are growing, they shade out any weeds that might want to
Right.
pop up. So it
Yeah.
creates a little mulch
Yeah.
that you can eat.
and just always having roots in the soil is good, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Another question from Sarah G. What would you do if you had raccoons getting into your garden and eating and destroying your crops?
Aw.
That is a really challenging situation, because obviously raccoons can climb, they can rip stuff open, so they're really hard to keep out with a fence.
I would
What-
cry.
Yeah. What we're planning on doing this year, because they love to eat corn, and a family of raccoons could decimate a corn patch this size if they got in there. What we're probably going to do is go around the top of the fence with a single strand of electric wire that will tie into our duck coop fence. And then if the raccoons try to climb over that, they'll get a little shock, and then they'll just steer clear of the garden. Obviously, that's kind of a big
Right, you have to have
task.
some infrastructure.
You have
for
to have
that.
an electric
Yeah.
fence and everything.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, something, the Three Sisters patch might help with that, because the squash and pumpkins, if there's enough of them completely surrounding the corn, when you're picking squash, those irritating barbs that make you itch and stuff, other animals are also susceptible to those, so they might be less likely to crawl through a whole bunch of that to get to the corn. All right, and then we've got a question from Brenna. How do you facilitate foraging spaces in small or potted gardens? And do you plan on setting aside space on the friend farm for foraging? Oh yeah. So I would say probably most of the space on the farm we're kind of letting go wild and having for wildlife areas. And then we're also planting a lot of native wild fruit trees. So yeah, we're definitely, that is like one of our favorite things about being able to manage land, is that we can kind of just turn it into a giant native food forest, which will benefit us and all the animals and insects. So yeah, we can, wow, the ducks are being really loud. I don't know if the mic is picking that up. But yeah, we can do like a full walkthrough similar to what we did in the garden to show all of the fruit trees and everything that we've planted at some point.
Yeah, but doing it in smaller potted gardens, that
have
is
one right there.
challenging. Well, that's not foraging though. That's
Yeah.
just like herbs and stuff. But yeah, I
That's
think
true. Well, she has like a patio garden, I believe.
yeah, I mean, I think you could encourage if the goal of foraging, right, which is I think a big part of it is like you don't have to actually put in very much labor, right? Because it's just happening already. You get to
Yeah.
go and just find the things that are, fruit that's dropping or greens that are ready. And that's the beauty of foraging. And so I think how you could replicate that in a small garden is planting some things that do self-seed readily and just kind of
Amaranth.
letting them do their thing.
Yeah.
Obviously that means you can't necessarily control, where they're going to go because it might just pop up everywhere. But yeah, things like lamb's quarters or other amaranths,
Purslane. A lot of these things that people are, call weeds and they're pulling out of
Right.
their garden, they grow so readily because they're, they're plants that are adapted to disturbance, but they're also great vegetables. So.
Right. And since it is in a potted garden, at least there's no real risk of it like fully taking over an entire
Yeah.
patch of earth, right? Because it's contained to these containers.
Right.
So that's what I would do. And I've definitely done that even in gardens that are in ground. It's just like, oh, some evening primrose came up and set seed. Like I'm
Yeah.
going to at least let a couple of them go to seed and
And then we
spread.
can have a giant Rubbermaid box of them in our basement for years and years
Hey,
that we never do anything
I
with.
processed them. We have a couple mason
Oh,
jars
okay.
full of evening primrose seeds.
I don't know if we've ever used them.
I
though.
put them in baked
Oh, you put them
bread.
in that bread. Okay, yes. Yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
But yeah, with like purslane, we're just going to let that go to seed in the garden because we don't mind having that grow all over the place. It's easy to pull out if you don't want it somewhere
Right.
for any reason, but it's also great to eat.
Yeah. Oh, nettle could be another good one if you don't mind
Oh,
the.
yeah. I grew that in a pot, a couple of years ago. That grew really well.
Sarah G coming through with the
Lots
questions.
of questions, yeah. I wrap row cover around my row of eggplants to keep the flea beetles out. Is there a time when I can take it off and not worry about the flea beetles decimating them? I think we showed in the garden tour that we are dealing with a similar problem.
Well, we should have put row cover, but we didn't.
Yeah, but even then, sometimes the flea beetles are dormant in the
Yeah.
native soil under the row cover, but it definitely helps, right? I would say once they're like a foot tall and the leaves are looking really green and lush, at that point the flea beetles might come on them and make those
Make
little
little holes.
dots, but they're not going to kill the plant like they will with our tiny ones that we put as a transplant, and then they immediately got covered in flea beetles.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. And the final question from Sarah G.
Why are my radishes usually, but not always, all greens and no radishes? That's interesting.
That is hard to know without seeing your specific radishes growing.
Well,
And
we
like,
do know her garden, and it might be a sunlight thing.
Well, I was gonna say, so
right?
it could be partly sunlight. Even though it's not a tomato, radishes still need a lot of sunlight to create that
Yeah.
root. And then part of it could be excess nitrogen and not as much like phosphorus.
Oh, right, yeah.
Just contributing to growing lots of green and not a lot of, root
Root.
development. But if you're not having that problem with other vegetables, that seems less likely. I will say I've had that problem too when I space them too close together sometimes because they kind of just start bolting, like going to
Right.
flower before the plant really bulbs out because I think they're feeling a little stressed and crowded. So what I would do is I would try spacing them a little further apart. Maybe try giving them some phosphorus and potassium, but not nitrogen, and planting them in a sunnier spot if you can.
Laura asks, I'm curious if you have any tips on how to choose land to farm. Were there certain characteristics you were looking for when purchasing your piece of land, like water access, soil type, etc.? Yeah, actually, those are two of the biggest things that we were thinking about, water access and soil type.
Yeah, so that was a big one. We have these creeks here. We got, I think, maybe more water than we really bargained for, but I would rather have a little too much than too little.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Also, the soil, because we're surrounded by creeks that have flooded over the thousands of years that this land has been here. The soil in the low parts is really rich topsoil that in some parts it's like 3 feet deep of just topsoil. So that's another thing to look out for.
yeah, we actually did a soil test as part of our like sale contingency.
Yeah.
We actually sampled several spots on the farm and sent them in, both for like nutrient analysis, just kind of for curiosity, and for contaminant detection, like if there were any
Yeah.
issues with heavy metals or whatever. So
Right.
that
Yeah,
was
if there
just
was,
for
like-
peace of mind.
If there's
Yeah.
ever like an old building site on the plot where you maybe want to grow food, that's a really important thing to test for, is like lead and other heavy metals, because that often accompanies houses being demolished or kind of falling apart. One last thing that I would recommend to consider is kind of like the slope. If it's a sloped piece of land, if you're sloped north, you're going to have a different microclimate than if you're sloped south, just because of, well, if you're in the northern hemisphere anyway, because of how the sun moves through the sky. And we're actually kind of sloped east here, which is not ideal for having a lot of sunlight exposure. But because it's such a big field with not a lot of tree cover, we get
Plenty.
12 hours of sunlight on the garden. So that's just something to consider. If you have a smaller space with some tree cover near the garden area,
Having a southern exposure is more important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, let's see. Kay asks, how different is your farm area versus Philadelphia? That's an interesting question. I would say, we're in a slightly different zone because we're up in the mountains of Pennsylvania. You're down in the lowlands in the Delaware River Basin. But the biggest difference, I would say, would be in a city, it's such a heat bank because there's concrete and buildings everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a lot hotter there in the summer than it is up here in the mountains, where there's a lot of green and things to soak up the heat. So I would say that's the biggest difference. I mean, other than that, we get a similar amount of rainfall and sunlight throughout the year. So it's probably very similar, with the exception of it being slightly hotter where you are.
Yeah. They also asked about our plans to plant any fruit trees,
Oh, yeah.
which you touched on before. So yes, we've planted lots of fruit trees. We have a little wildlife kind of orchard going, as well as a more human-centric orchard going. And as those develop, we'll definitely share more about them. Right now, they kind of just look like sticks with leaves, so
Yeah.
they're not too exciting. But
And in the garden, inside the garden space, we actually plan on building a little bed in every one of the corners and putting like a dwarf fruit tree in there. So we're excited about that too. All right, and then our last question comes from Marin. What's your next gardening project or goal? And do you save most of the seeds yourselves, or are there things that you prefer buying? So yeah, as for our next gardening project,
well, the field up there.
yeah, the staple crop field. So, we mentioned before that we've grown in limited spaces and community gardens in the city for years. And my dream has always been to have like an actual staple crop field full of like dry beans and flower corn and sunflowers and things like that. And this year that dream becomes a reality. So yeah, we've been working hard on that, and actually all the corn and beans are starting to germinate now. So it's beautiful up there. And then I guess it's kind of a gardening project. Sylvan's leading the charge on building a duck coop out of wattle and daub.
Yes, I'm excited to get that done. I mean, the ducks are a part of the garden, so it is relevant. But we're tired of having to run around and chase them and catch them to put them back in their little run coop at the end of every day, because it's not.
What they think is happening is that we're torturing them.
I know, we're literally putting them in a nice, safe space with food and water, but they're like freaking out the entire time. So we're excited to have a coop so we can just open the door and let them out into the pasture with the electric fence, and then let them back in at night.
And the electric fence is not really for them. Like, they could just wander, but it's to keep predators out when we're not around. So foxes and raccoons, everything wants to eat ducks, including hawks and eagles. But these breeds are so big that most hawks
they could take it.
can't even handle them. An eagle probably could, but you know, the eagles they come around every once in a while, but not often.
Yeah.
All right, enough about ducks. And then, yeah, so do we save most of
Oh,
the seeds
yes.
ourselves? Yes, we save a lot of seeds, mostly from things where the fruit or seeds is what we're eating on the plant. And then we just set a few aside. So, like our corn, beans, squash, watermelon, tomatoes, peppers. Yeah, jinx.
Did you say everything in sync now?
But then things like greens and cabbage, where you're actually killing the plant before you let it go to seed, we don't really bother with those. So we do buy those from heirloom seed companies. And then also, you know, I'm obsessed with flour corn and flint corn and popcorn. So usually every year I'll order a few new varieties that
Right,
I've
we
never...
have plenty. Like, we definitely don't need to,
Yeah.
but just because it's fun to try the new varieties.
Yeah, so we hope you enjoyed this video. We thought it was a really fun format to put together. So if people do
Yeah.
enjoy this, we'll probably do a lot more garden tours and answering Patreon questions throughout the season. So yeah, let us know if you enjoyed this video, and if so, we'll make another one
Good.
soon. Yeah. All right.
Bye!
y'all. Oh, and stick around for a minute if you want to see some beautiful nature scenes with our friend Ethan's incredible piano music, which you can also listen to on, you know, any music streaming platform. So look him up, Ethan Lennox. Music from the back of the house, which
That's
is
right.
where he records it, is in the back of his house.
Yeah.
But anyway, all right. Have a great day.
Bye.